Frank Dalton walked out of prison with a clear plastic bag in his hand and a cold wind in his face. In the bag was $63, a worn photo of his wife holding their little boy, and a brass coin he used to rub for luck when the nights got long. 25 years behind bars had turned his life into something light enough to carry, but the weight was still in his chest. He stood outside the gate for a moment and just breathed. No guard shouted at him. No buzzer told him where to go. The sky was wide and gray, and it felt almost too big. Frank was 59. He went in at 34 with strong hands and a laugh that came easy. Now his hands shook in the cold, and his laugh felt like something he had misplaced. A prison bus waited near the fence. Frank climbed on and sat in the back, holding his bag on his lap like it might disappear. As the bus rolled away, the razor wire and concrete slid past the window. Frank kept watching until it was gone, like he was making sure it could not pull him back. All the way home, he tried to remember his front porch. He tried to see his wife Helen sitting in the swing, smiling as his truck came up the drive. He tried to hear his son Evan running through the yard calling for him. Evan was 9 when Frank went in. 9 plus 25. The number did not feel real. A grown man, somewhere in the world, who had learned to live without his father. Frank grew up in Hickory Ridge. His dad left when Frank was 12, one winter morning, without much more than a note on the kitchen table. Frank's mother worked long shifts at a nursing home, and Frank learned early how to make canned soup taste like a real meal. Ray was still little then, the kind of kid who followed Frank around and wanted to do everything Frank did. Frank became a second parent before he was even old enough to shave. He got a paper route, then a job at the mill, then another job fixing cars on weekends. When their mother died, Frank paid the bills and kept the house from slipping away. Ray never forgot that Frank was the one who held things together. But Ray also never stopped resenting it. Frank did not see the resentment back then. He just saw his brother. He met Helen at a church fish fry. Helen had a quick smile and eyes that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. She liked Frank because he was steady. He liked her because she made steadiness feel warm instead of heavy. They married young, scraped together money, and bought a small white house on Maple Lane. When Evan was born, Frank cried so hard he had to hide his face in Helen's shoulder. He promised that kid he would never leave. That promise was the one that later kept him alive, even when the world tried to break it. The trouble started in the summer of 2000. Frank worked at the steel mill in Hickory Ridge, Ohio. It was hot work, loud work, but it kept food on the table, and it came with a union pension Frank was proud of. Helen worked part-time at the library. She liked the quiet and the smell of old paper. Their life was not fancy, but it was steady. Then Frank came home early one afternoon and found his younger brother Ray sitting on the porch steps. Ray was 5 years younger, sharp-dressed, even when he had no business being sharp-dressed, and he could talk his way into almost anything. Frank had been cleaning up Ray's messes since they were kids. Ray had the kind of charm that made strangers trust him and made family forgive him. That day, Ray looked scared. His eyes were red, and his hands would not stay still. "Frank," Ray said, voice low. "I need your help." Frank felt his shoulders tighten. "What did you do?" Ray swallowed hard and told him he owed money. Not a little, $120,000. Frank stared like he had misheard. Ray said he got in with the wrong people, and now they wanted payment or pain. Frank should have walked away right then. But Ray was his brother, and Frank had always been the one who held the rope when Ray started falling. Ray said he had a plan. He said he worked some side books for Calvin Price, the rich owner of a trucking company in town. Ray said he found proof Price was stealing, cheating, moving money where it did not belong. Ray said he copied records. He said he could force Price to pay him to keep quiet. Frank told him to go to the police. Ray shook his head. "Sheriff Brenner is Price's friend," he said. "If I go to the cops, I am dead." Ray pulled a small metal box from his jacket. "Hold this for me," he said. "If something happens, it has copies of everything." Frank did not want to touch it. He did anyway. He hid it in a drawer in the garage workbench and told Ray to leave town. Ray promised he would. He swore on their mother's grave. That night, Helen asked Frank what Ray wanted. Frank tried to brush it off, but Helen's eyes stayed on him. Do not drag us into his mess, she said. Frank wanted to argue. He wanted to say, family helps family. But Helen was not cruel. She was careful, and careful people often see danger first. Frank said, I will handle it. Helen touched his cheek and said, just come home safe. 3 weeks later, Calvin Price was found dead in his office, shot twice. No struggle, just a clean, cold killing. Frank heard it on the radio and felt his stomach drop. He went to the garage, opened the drawer, and stared at the box. He did not open it. He told himself it had nothing to do with him. 2 days later, 4 cruisers came roaring into his driveway. Sheriff Brenner stepped out like he had been waiting for this moment. Frank Dalton, Brenner said, you are under arrest for the murder of Calvin Price. Helen ran onto the porch, white-faced. Evan stood behind her, eyes wide, not understanding why his dad was being put in handcuffs like a stranger. Frank kept saying it was a mistake. Brenner did not care. They marched Frank to the car while neighbors watched from yards and windows. At the station, they showed Frank pictures he could not look at. They told him his fingerprints were on the gun. They told him a camera caught his truck near the company that night. They told him there was a cash withdrawal from his bank account, $8,000, right before the murder. Frank said it was not true. Then they brought in Ray. Ray told the police. Frank was angry at Price. Ray said Frank talked about revenge. Ray said Frank told him, keep your mouth shut. Frank felt the room tilt. He realized Ray was not scared anymore. Ray was calm. Ray was safe. Because Ray had handed the danger to him, Frank asked to call Helen. They said later, he asked to call a lawyer. They said he would get one in court. He asked, where is the box? No one answered that, and Frank understood deep down that they already had it. The trial moved fast, like a machine that did not care what it crushed. Frank's court-appointed lawyer did not have money for experts. The prosecutor told the jury Frank was bitter and jealous, and that he hired a drifter to do the shooting. Ray took the stand in a clean suit and cried. He said he was scared of his own brother. Frank watched his brother lie, and still, for a moment, his brain tried to refuse it, because believing it meant accepting that the person you grew up with could choose to destroy you. The jury came back guilty. The judge gave Frank 40 years, with no parole for 25. Helen made a sound like her heart had been ripped open. Evan screamed. Frank turned to look at his son as deputies pulled him away. Evan's face was wet, and Frank knew he was about to miss everything. Frank begged for one thing. Let me hug my boy. The deputy shook his head. No touching. Frank carried that moment like a stone for years. Prison did not break Frank in one blow. It wore him down in small pieces. Same walls, same noise, same smell. He learned to keep his eyes down. He learned to swallow anger until it burned his throat. He learned to sleep with one ear open. He learned the hard way that you can be innocent and still get hurt, because innocence is not armor in a place built for punishment. Helen wrote every week at first. Her letters were careful, like she was trying to hold their life together with ink. She said Evan missed him. She said she was selling the second car to pay for a lawyer. She said Ray was helping with paperwork. That line made Frank's stomach twist. Frank wrote back again and again. Do not trust Ray. Do not let him near our money. Do not let him near our son. Helen wrote that Ray was family and she needed help. She said Ray drove Evan to school when her car broke. She said Ray paid for groceries one week. Frank could hear the exhaustion in her words. He hated himself for being trapped where he could not fix anything. Then the letters started coming less. Then they stopped. Frank kept writing. No answer. In prison, there are days when the silence is louder than shouting. Frank would stand at mail call with his hands sweating, waiting to hear his name. Day after day, nothing. He started making deals with himself. If a letter comes tomorrow, I can handle another month. If a letter comes this week, I can handle another year. He counted weeks until numbers felt meaningless. Months later, the chaplain told him Helen was dead. Cancer. Fast. Frank did not get a funeral. He did not get a goodbye. He got a short note and a hole in his chest that never filled back in. He asked the chaplain if he could call Evan. The chaplain said he would try. No call ever came. Frank grieved like a man trapped under ice, quiet on the outside, screaming on the inside. After Helen died, Frank tried to write to his house. The letters came back, stamped vacant. He stared at that word until his eyes hurt. Vacant. Like his life had been emptied out and left on the curb. Frank asked the prison counselor if he could get records on where his son lived. The counselor shrugged. Try the state. Try child services. Try anyone. Frank wrote letters to offices that never answered. He learned what it feels like to be erased in slow motion. Years passed. Frank grew gray. His hands got rough from prison jobs. He worked in the laundry, then in the kitchen. He learned how to keep his head down and still keep his spine. He met a few men who had done terrible things and a few who were just unlucky. He met an old inmate named Charles who told him one quiet truth. Prison is full of people who made one bad choice and full of people who made no choice at all. Frank held on to one thing. The thought that someday Evan would know the truth. On nights when the cell got too small, Frank would take out the photo and talk to it under his breath. He would tell Helen what he remembered about her. He would tell Evan about the way he used to fall asleep on Frank's shoulder during fireworks. Frank did not know if those memories helped or hurt. He only knew they were his. A young volunteer named Maya Grant started coming to the prison library. She helped inmates fill out forms, looked people in the eye, and did not flinch from hard stories. She was not loud. She was not soft either. She had a calm in her that made people want to tell the truth. Frank brought her a stack of returned mail and asked if she could help him find his son. Maya asked questions that felt like a light moving through darkness. Did you ever sign anything that gave your brother access to your accounts? Frank remembered a power of attorney from years ago, signed when Helen had surgery. Ray had told him it was smart. Maya nodded like she had expected that. She asked to see Frank's case file. Frank said yes, because hope is hard to kill when someone finally listens. Maya came back again and again. She dug through records, called offices, filed requests. Frank learned not to ask, "Are you still working on it?" He learned to trust her steady steps. One day, she slid copies through the glass. Frank's pension payout had been cashed out in 2001. Frank never saw it. The deposit went into an account that belonged to Ray. Maya found a deed transfer too. Frank's house had been sold under Frank's name, signed by Ray as attorney in fact. Maya found school records for Evan. They showed Evan moved in with Ray after Helen got sick. Frank sat in his cell that night and stared at the wall until it turned into morning. He thought of Helen trying to keep food on the table while Ray picked her clean. He thought of Evan growing up under Ray's roof, hearing Ray's stories. He felt rage like a fire, then grief like water. Maya did not stop. She became a lawyer and took Frank's case to an innocence clinic in Columbus. In 2025, she filed a petition for review. A retired detective came forward, a man named Tom Lasky. He said Sheriff Brenner pushed the case through and told everyone to stop asking questions. Lasky said there had been a witness, an old night janitor at Price Freight, who saw a smaller man with a limp leaving the building that night. The sheriff told the witness he was confused and sent him away. Maya found the witness, Earl Morton, in a nursing home. Earl was old, but when Maya showed him pictures, his finger did not shake. "Not Frank," he said. "That one." He pointed at Ray. Maya brought Earl's statement to court. She brought the money trail, the deed transfer, the power of attorney, and Lasky's affidavit. The judge agreed there was enough to reopen the case. The state offered Frank a deal, time served, release with a conviction still on paper. Frank refused. He wanted his name clean for Evan. The judge released Frank on bond, pending a new trial. That is how Frank ended up on the bus in the winter of 2026, heading back to Hickory Ridge with a bag and a photo and a heart full of fear. The bus dropped him at a gas station on Main Street. The town looked familiar in shape but strange in details. New signs, new stores, people staring at small screens in their hands. Frank walked toward Maple Lane, knees stiff, breath coming out in white clouds. When he reached the end of the street, he saw his house. White siding, blue shutters, the maple tree in the yard taller than he remembered. He stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, like his feet forgot how to move. A man stepped onto the porch, holding a coffee mug. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair with gray at the sides. Frank knew that face. The jaw, the eyes. Evan. Frank's throat tightened. Evan, he said. The man on the porch stiffened. Who are you? Frank pulled the old photo from his bag and held it up with shaking hands. It's me, he said. It's Dad. Evan stared at the photo, then at Frank's face. For a moment, he looked like a boy again, struck silent by something too big, then his face hardened. My dad is in prison, he said. Frank nodded. I was. I got out. Evan walked down the steps slowly. His voice came out rough. Where were you when Mom got sick? Frank's knees almost buckled. I did not know, he whispered. I was in there. Evan's eyes flashed. Uncle Ray said you stopped writing. He said you did not care. Frank swallowed hard. I wrote every week. Letters came back. Evan looked confused, then angry again. Ray said Mom threw your letters away. Frank shook his head. Ray lied. He sold this house using my name. He took my pension. Evan stared at him like he did not know what to do with that. Frank asked to come inside. Evan hesitated, then stepped aside. Frank walked into his own house like a stranger. The rooms were the same shape, but the life inside them was not his. Family photos on the wall showed Evan grown, with a wife and kids. A teenage girl watched from the hallway. A younger boy peeked from behind her. Frank felt dizzy, but he held himself up. In the kitchen, Evan demanded answers. Frank slid Maya's copies across the table. Evan read the deed transfer and the pension paperwork. His face went pale. He whispered, I did not know. Frank believed him. Evan looked up with wet eyes. Why would Ray do this? Frank's voice was low. Because he needed someone to take the fall. Because he wanted what I had. Evan sat back, shaking. Ray raised me, he said. He was like a father. Frank's eyes stung. I am sorry. Evan wiped his face. If you are telling the truth, then my whole life is built on a lie. Frank nodded. I know. Evan took a slow breath. Then I need to help fix it. That evening, Evan's wife Marissa came home early. Evan told her everything in a low voice while Frank sat on the edge of a chair, hands folded, trying not to look like a threat. Marissa watched Frank with cautious eyes. She was not cold. She was scared because sudden truth can feel like danger. When Evan finished, Marissa looked at Frank and said, I am sorry. Frank wanted to say, no, I am sorry for being a stranger in your home. Instead, he just nodded. The kids came home next. Tessa stared at Frank like she was trying to decide if she hated him or pitied him. Luke looked curious. Evan told them Frank was his father. Luke said, so you are my grandpa. Frank's throat tightened at the word. He had never expected to hear it. He managed a small smile and said, yes, I guess I am. Luke walked up and touched Frank's hand like he was checking if Frank was real. Your hands are rough, Luke said. Frank nodded. They got that way. Tessa rolled her eyes and said, Luke, stop being weird. But Frank saw her watching, and he understood. Older kids feel things they cannot name, so they act tough. That night, Frank slept in a room that used to be Evan's, in the house that used to be Frank's. He lay awake listening to the furnace click and the wind tap the window. He thought about the first time he taught Evan how to throw a baseball. He thought about Helen brushing Evan's hair after a bath. He felt guilt like a tight band. Even though he was not the one who chose prison, he was still the one who was gone. In the dark, he whispered to the ceiling, I am here now. He did not know if anyone could hear him. The next day, Maya met them in town. Evan brought a folder of old papers he found in a cabinet. He brought something else too, an envelope hidden behind a drawer. Inside was Helen's note, the original, in her handwriting. Frank pressed it to his chest, eyes burning. Evan stared at the table and whispered, Ray told me he burned everything. Maya's face turned hard. He did more than burn paper, she said. He burned years. Maya asked Evan about Ray's limp. Evan nodded slowly. Ray limped for a while back then. He said it was a ladder fall. Maya exchanged a look with Frank. That matches the witness, she said. Then Evan remembered another detail. Ray used to wake up sweating at night, Evan said. He would sit in the living room and stare at the door like he expected someone to come in. I thought it was stress from raising me. Now I think it was guilt. Maya asked Evan for one more thing. Write down everything you remember, she said, even the small stuff, dates, places. What he said and what he did not say, Small stuff is how lies unravel. The hearing came fast. Frank sat in court while Maya laid out the evidence. Money stolen. Property sold. A witness ignored. A sheriff too close to the wrong man. Evan took the stand and told the truth about Ray controlling mail and shaping the story of Frank's guilt. His voice shook, but he held on. If I am wrong, he said, it would be easier for me. But I am not wrong. My dad did not do it. Outside the courthouse, Sheriff Brenner tried to corner Evan in the parking lot. Frank saw it happen. Brenner spoke low, leaning in like a friend. Evan's shoulders stiffened. Frank walked over, and Maya stepped in too. Brenner smiled at Frank like a man showing his teeth. You think you can rewrite what happened, Brenner said. Frank looked him in the eye. You rewrote it first. Brenner's face tightened. Watch your mouth. Maya's voice stayed calm. Sheriff, she said, threats do not look good when the record is being reopened. Brenner held her gaze, then turned and walked away. Frank watched him go and felt something shift. For the first time, Brenner looked unsure. The judge took a recess. When he returned, he said the words Frank had waited 25 years to hear. This court vacates the conviction pending a new trial. Frank's shackles came off in the courtroom. Evan hugged him hard, and Frank felt the years squeeze between them like air leaving a balloon. Outside, reporters gathered. Some people from town stood back, watching. Frank recognized faces. A man who used to wave at him. A woman who used to borrow sugar from Helen. They looked at Frank now like they did not know where to put their shame. Frank did not say anything. He was too busy breathing. 2 days later, Ray was arrested for fraud and identity theft. Once the case cracked open, the rest fell fast. The drifter the prosecutor blamed was found alive and talked. He said Ray paid him. He said Ray promised the sheriff would point the finger at Frank. Soon, the state had enough for murder charges too. Ray's towing shop was raided. Sheriff Brenner was put on leave. The town turned its face away from the man it used to praise. Maya told Frank they wanted him at the grand jury. Frank sat across from Ray in a small room that smelled like old coffee. Ray wore an orange jumpsuit. His charm was gone. He tried to smile anyway. "Brother," Ray said. Frank looked at him and felt only sadness. "Explain it," Frank said. Ray's voice broke. "I was scared," he said. Price was going to ruin me. I went to talk, and it went bad, and I shot him. Frank's jaw clenched. "Then you framed me," Ray cried. "I had to. I had no choice." Frank leaned forward. "You had choices every day for 25 years. You watched Helen die. You raised my son on lies." Ray whispered, "I took care of him." Frank's voice went cold. "You used him." Ray shook, then nodded like he could not fight the truth anymore. He confessed. He admitted the forgery. He admitted working with Brenner. He admitted using the power of attorney. When Ray was led away, he turned once and said, "Tell Evan I loved him." Frank did not answer. Love without honesty is not love. It is a hook. The exoneration hearing came in the spring. Frank stood in court while the judge read the findings and apologized on behalf of the state. "Mr. Dalton," the judge said, "you are fully exonerated." Frank did not fall to his knees. He did not shout. He just breathed, deep, like his lungs had been waiting. Outside, Evan held his hand in front of the cameras. Marissa stood close. The kids watched, quiet. Luke asked later, "Grandpa, does this mean you are really free?" Frank smiled. "Yes," he said. "It does. Ray was sentenced to life for murder, plus time for the theft and fraud." Sheriff Brenner went to prison for obstruction and conspiracy. Frank never visited either of them. He had spent enough years behind locked doors. The state offered Frank money. It did not fix what was broken, but it gave him a chance to start over. Frank did not take Evan's house back. That house held Evan's memories now too. Frank bought a small place nearby, plain and warm, with a porch and a little patch of dirt. Evan helped him paint. Luke helped plant tomatoes. Tessa pretended she was too cool to help and still showed up with a brush. On quiet nights, Frank sat on his porch and talked to Helen in his head. He told her the truth. Came out. He told her Evan was safe. He told her he was sorry he could not hold her hand at the end. Sometimes Evan would sit beside him and they would not talk at all. Silence between them used to be a wall. Now, it was a bridge. Evan said one evening, I loved Ray. Frank nodded. You do not have to erase what you felt, he said, but you can be honest about what he did. Evan's eyes filled. I feel stupid. Frank shook his head. You were young, and you trusted the man who was there. That is not stupidity. That is being human. They went to Helen's grave on a Sunday. Frank traced her name on the stone with a shaking finger. Evan set flowers down and whispered, Mom would be happy. Frank nodded. I hope so. As they walked back to the car, Evan looked at Frank and said, Thank you for coming back. Frank swallowed, voice thick. You are worth coming back to. Months later, Luke brought home a school project, a family tree. Next to Frank's name, Luke wrote, Came home after 25 years, got the truth, started over. Frank stared at those simple words and felt a strange peace. Freedom was not simple at first. Frank would wake up before dawn, heart racing, sure a guard was about to bang on his door. He would sit on the edge of the bed and wait for a sound that never came, then remind himself, You are home. The first time Evan took him to the grocery store, Frank froze in the middle of an aisle. Too many choices. Too many bright lights. Too many people moving close without looking up. In prison, you watch every hand. Outside, nobody watched at all. Evan touched his shoulder and said, It is okay, Dad. We can leave. Frank nodded, embarrassed but grateful. Some nights, the past came back in small ways. A car backfired, and Frank flinched. A siren went by, and his stomach tightened. Marissa would hand him a cup of tea and sit with him at the table until his breathing slowed. Tessa acted like she did not care, but she started leaving a soft blanket on his chair, like a quiet peace offering. Luke asked questions that were too honest to dodge. Were you lonely? Did you ever think you would not come home? Frank answered in simple words, because kids can smell lies. One afternoon, Frank went to the diner on Main Street. The booths were the same, the smell of coffee and bacon the same. A waitress with gray hair stopped when she saw him. Frank? She said his name like it was a question. Frank nodded. I am back. Her eyes filled. I should have written you, she whispered. Frank did not know what to do with that. He just said, I am here now. That night, Evan brought Frank a phone. So you can call me any time, Evan said. Frank held it like it might break. Evan showed him the buttons, slow and patient. Frank did not understand all of it, but he understood what it meant. A line back to his son. A way to not be alone. He did not get payback with violence. He got it with the truth. He got it with a courtroom record that finally matched reality. He got it with his son's hand on his shoulder and his grandkid's arms around his neck. The men who lied went to prison. The town had to live with what it ignored. And Frank, the man they tried to erase, woke up each morning in his own bed, poured coffee, and watched his family walk through his door. That was the part Ray could never steal. Not for 25 years. Not for a day.